Stanley Kubrick was an avid reader. As soon as he finished one movie, he would start reading again. Not in a systematic way, but randomly, on purpose, to find that next story to adapt for the big screen. And so it happened that in the spring of 1976, after throwing myriad books against the wall, there was an extended silence. He was reading Stephen King's The Shining. Kubrick had received an early manuscript through Warner Brothers, and it became his next project. Of course, it was not in his nature to read a story and simply adapt it into a screenplay. Oh no. He researched his movies extensively, and in The Shining's case he did so by reading, among others, Bruno Bettelheim, Sigmund Freud, H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen Crane, Franz Kafka, and Diane Johnson. Bettelheim was a child psychologist and had published a book in 1975 disclosing the benefits of fairy tales for young children, especially between the ages of 5 and 8, which happened to be Danny the character's and actor's age. There were so many tales to choose from, obviously, as they go back in time millennia. Their use of archetypes, simple characters, and easy-to-understand metaphors help children unconsciously calibrate to a seemingly incomprehensible and unjust world around them. Kubrick also commonly used archetypes in his movies and peppered The Shining with subtle and not-so-subtle fairy tale symbology. The first direct reference occurs 10 minutes in when we see Dopey the dwarf on Danny's door. Say that 10 times fast. Possibly a subtle reference to Danny being, certainly not the dopiest of course, but perhaps the simplest character at this point. And also to Snow White, who, like Wendy, has dark hair, light skin, and is woken by her savior, not via a kiss, but an instrument of the lips anyway. During Wendy's tour of the Overlook Kitchen, there's this overt reference to Hansel and Gretel.
This whole place is such an enormous maze, I feel like I'll have to leave a trail of breadcrumbs every time I come in.
And later, Jack taunts Wendy as he becomes the wolf from the Three Little Pigs.
I'll hop,
Little pigs,
and I'll pop, and I'll
little
blow
pigs,
your house in.
let me come in. Not by the hair on your chinny chin chin. Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in.
These two stories share a common fairy tale trope. The small and/or weak hero outsmarts the villain, just as Danny does to his father. Additionally, there are several instances of Jack and the Beanstalk poking through, except in the tale Jack is the hero, like the evil giant's wife feeding our hero, and the giant chasing him until he's finally defeated via the boy's ingenuity. With the boy and his mother finally living, we hope, happily ever after. Could the fairy tale nature of The Shining explain some of its, let's say, exaggerated acting? After all, Bettelheim himself said, children experience such extreme emotions that they need exaggerated stories to make them feel less afraid of these feelings. Just as fairy tales often use archetypes, so did Kubrick. Co-writer Diane Johnson specifically called The Shining an archetypal situation, so it made sense to fold it into the Kubrick oeuvre. Have you noticed that Kubrick also used the same trope as a contemporary blockbuster fantasy film? A genre that Kubrick equated to fairy tales? Yes, Star Wars, which features our hero's mentor, eventually getting killed by the main villain, who also happens to be the hero's father. So it should come as no surprise to learn that George Lucas thought of Star Wars as a fairy tale. What with the fantastical setting, archetypes, and simple good versus evil narrative. Perhaps part of the reason Star Wars was such a huge hit is that it filled the modern fairy tale vacuum during a pessimistic time in America. But enough about Star Wars. We'll return to some of these ideas in the next video. Anyway, Bruno Bettelheim looked at fairy tales through the lens of Sigmund Freud and believed they help children coalesce their id, ego, and superego, which benefits their progression toward adulthood. Freud knew a thing or two about uncanniness, a feeling Kubrick tried to evoke throughout The Shining. Freud's essay on it was also a major influence.
He made an interesting point. He said that the uncanny is the only emotion, or the only feeling, which for most people is more powerfully experienced in art or literature than in life.
Freud goes on to explain how uncanniness can be optimized in fiction, and it sounds almost exactly like The Shining. The situation is altered as soon as the writer pretends to move in the world of reality. Everything that would have an uncanny effect in reality has it in his story, but he can increase his effect and multiply it far beyond what could happen in reality by bringing about events which never or very rarely happen in fact. He deceives us into thinking that he's giving us the sober truth, and then after all oversteps the bounds of possibility. We react to his inventions as we should have reacted to real experiences. By the time we have seen through his trick, it is already too late, and the author has achieved his object, but his success is not unalloyed. We retain a feeling of dissatisfaction, a kind of grudge against the deceit, particularly after stories which flirt with the supernatural. The author should keep us in the dark for a long time about the precise nature of the world he writes about, or he should cunningly and ingeniously avoid any definite information on the point at all throughout. Fiction presents more opportunities for uncanny sensations than real life. Considering Kubrick loved the way King's book, as he put it, deceived the reader into thinking the supernatural would be explained by the psychological, allowing you to suspend doubt until you were so thoroughly into the story that ghosts could be accepted almost without noticing. Doesn't Freud's quote sum up The Shining uncannily well?
Yes, it is, Mr. Torrance.
Only a few years after Freud's essay The Master, as Kubrick called him, H.P. Lovecraft, wrote his own historical review of what he called weird horror literature. It's a fascinating read that probably reveals more about Lovecraft than it does about the writers he critiqued, but he explains many different ways authors have induced weird feelings over the centuries, at times sounding like he's literally predicting The Shining. Was there some desire by Kubrick to fulfill Freud and Lovecraft's wishes for future uncanny tales? Crane, by the way, wrote a short story that Kubrick read in preparation called The Blue Hotel, which evoked paranoia and dread, two of the many emotions Kubrick was trying to bring to his own horror story. But he also knew that telling a fantastic horror tale would not be as effective as one set in the real world, and that's where Franz Kafka comes in. Despite writing about absurd subjects, like a man turning into a beetle, he tells his stories very straightforwardly. Kubrick called his style almost journalistic. That's why The Shining is grounded in an apparent real world, with normal, even bright lighting conditions and evidently real physical ghosts as well, not the transparent or floating ones we see elsewhere in fiction.
When you do read reports of people who have seen ghosts and things like that, you always describe them as being as solid and real as someone standing in the room. Only in movies has the convention come up of ghosts being ethereal. The descriptions I've ever read where people actually claim they've seen ghosts, that people are very solid and real.
Kubrick's goal in making The Shining may have been to create a modern fairy tale, but for adults. After all, we need them too. He thought ghost stories contain an inherent optimism because of their promise of an afterlife. In my next video, we'll look closer at Diane Johnson, Stephen King, and many more contemporary influences on what has been called not necessarily Kubrick's best film, but his most crucial. See you then.